The Mexican Mafia is one of the most powerful and dangerous prison gangs in the United States, with significant influence over Latino street gangs both inside and outside prisons, especially in Southern California. Over the years, it has been involved in several violent internal and external conflicts. Here are 5 notable gang wars or major violent conflicts involving the Mexican Mafia. Number 4, the Mexican Mafia versus Maravilla gangs, 1970s to 1990s. Rebellion, Retribution, and the War for East LA. In the shadowy world of California, prison politics, and Los Angeles street gangs, few conflicts have been as fierce or culturally symbolic as the war between the Mexican Mafia and the Maravilla gangs. This feud, spanning over 2 decades from the 1970s to the 1990s, was not just about territory or drug profits. It was about autonomy, defiance, and the refusal of one neighborhood to bow to the prison empire known as La M. What followed was a violent campaign of assassinations, green lights, and community bloodshed that left a lasting scar on East LA and reshaped the Latino gang landscape in Southern California. One of La M's most significant strategies was its integration with the Sureño network, Southern California Latino gangs that pledged allegiance to La M. These gangs, while maintaining their own identities, operated under La M's authority, both inside and outside prison. Defying La M meant certain death or greenlighting, an official death warrant issued by the prison gang. In contrast, the Maravilla gangs, based in the unincorporated East Los Angeles area known as Maravilla, had their own deep roots and unique identity. Maravilla gangs such as Lopez Maravilla, Ford Maravilla, Arizona Maravilla, and others traced their origins back to the 1940s and 1950s, making them some of the oldest Chicano gangs in LA. Unlike many other barrios, Maravilla retained a strong sense of independence and cultural pride, and its members were skeptical of outside authority, including that of the Mexican Mafia. Maravilla gang members were known for being heavily involved in local politics and were considered somewhat more militant and anti-establishment than other gangs. They also had a reputation for unity among their many subsets. While most other LA gangs eventually accepted La M's dominance by the 1970s, the Maravilla gangs stood apart. By the mid-1970s, La M had successfully brought most Southern California Latino gangs under its control. However, the Maravilla gangs refused to pay taxes to La M or submit to its prison hierarchy. This refusal was seen by La M not just as disrespect, but as a threat to its authority over all Sureños. Being greenlit meant any gang member from a Maravilla clique could be killed on sight by any Sureño or M associate, both inside and outside of prison. This decision triggered a campaign of violence that would persist for decades. Murders, stabbings, ambushes, and retaliations became commonplace in East LA, the jails, and the prison yards. Throughout the 1980s, the war between the Mexican Mafia and Maravilla gangs intensified. In prison, Maravilla gang members were often segregated or placed in protective custody due to the high risk of attack. On the streets, Maravilla gangsters had to move cautiously, constantly at risk of being targeted by rival Sureños acting under La M's orders. Yet the Maravilla gangs remained defiant. They formed closer alliances with each other, at times consolidating resources and even coordinating defense strategies. They refused to adopt the 13 suffix used by Sureños to signify loyalty to La M. M is the 13th letter of the alphabet, and publicly denounced the Mafia's control. The community itself became a battleground. East LA was already under pressure from police crackdowns, economic hardship, and drug epidemics. The Maravilla-M war added another layer of trauma. Residents witnessed shootouts in alleys, young men gunned down for refusing to fall in line, and entire families affected by the cycle of violence. The Mexican Mafia didn't operate like a traditional gang. It wielded influence through fear, control, and a structured internal system. Orders given in prison would be carried out on the streets. Maravilla gang members who entered jail or prison often faced the stark choice: submit or die. LAM used the green light list as a primary tool of enforcement. Once a gang or individual was greenlit, all sureños were expected to attack or kill them on sight. Disobedience meant a death sentence for the one who ignored the order. This mechanism made it extremely dangerous for any gang to challenge LAM, and it was rare for anyone to survive long once greenlit. However, Maravilla's resilience became legendary. Members created coded communication networks, formed their own protection alliances in prisons, and continued to operate in East LA despite the ever-present threat. By the early 1990s, the conflict had shown no signs of resolution. The crack cocaine epidemic had swept through East LA, and the drug trade became a larger battlefield. Maravilla gangs refusing to pay taxes to LAM were seen as taking profits away from the Mafia, further justifying ongoing attacks in their eyes. Law enforcement also began to turn more attention to LAM and its activities. Several major federal and state operations targeted high-ranking M members. These investigations revealed how deeply LAM had penetrated the street gang scene and exposed the ongoing conflict with Maravilla. Still, the green light remained in effect. Maravilla continued to exist as a defiant outlier, proudly unaffiliated with sureños and opposed to LAM's coercion. Some Maravilla members were caught in the crossfire, arrested, or killed, while others went into hiding or joined other independent cliques outside LA. The Mexican Mafia Maravilla War is a powerful chapter in the broader history of Latino gang culture in Los Angeles. Unlike most other gang rivalries, it was not based on geography or race, but on ideology and defiance. Maravilla's refusal to conform to a criminal empire earned it both admiration and relentless punishment. For many, Maravilla became a symbol of resistance within a system dominated by hierarchical control. For LAM, crushing Maravilla was about setting an example. No gang, no matter how historic or proud, could operate outside the Mafia's authority. The war between the Mexican Mafia and the Maravilla gangs from the 1970s to the 1990s was a brutal and symbolic struggle for power and identity. It showcased the lengths to which LAM would go to maintain its dominance and the rare courage it took for a group to resist that power. While much has changed in California's gang and prison politics since the 1990s, the legacy of this conflict remains embedded in East LA's streets, in prison lore, and in the enduring history of defiance among the Maravilla cliques. Number 3. Mexican Mafia greenlighting of Southern California gangs, 90s to 2000s. Discipline through death. From the 1990s into the 2000s, the Mexican Mafia, known as LAM, tightened its grip over Southern California's street gangs with a level of coordination and brutality rarely seen in the history of organized crime. During this era, LAM used a powerful tool known as the green light to impose discipline, eliminate rivals, and enforce absolute obedience. The consequences were lethal, reshaping gang alliances, instilling fear across the region, and embedding a culture of subjugation that persists today. To understand the Mexican Mafia's green lighting of gangs, one must understand what a green light is. A green light is a formal or unofficial death order issued by LAM. When a person or gang is greenlit, any gang member aligned with LAM, especially sureños, Southern California Hispanic gangs, is authorized and expected to attack or kill the target without hesitation. Green lights are issued for various reasons: refusing to pay taxes, tribute, disrespecting LAM members, cooperating with law enforcement, violating prison rules, or challenging the Mafia's authority. In some cases, entire gangs were placed on the green light list, turning neighborhoods into active war zones and making prison yards battlegrounds for survival. By the early 1990s, the Mexican Mafia had successfully aligned most Southern California Hispanic gangs under the Sureño umbrella. While each Sureño gang retained its own name and neighborhood identity, they were expected to follow La M's directives, both on the streets and in prison. This alignment allowed La M to enforce a system of taxation, requiring gangs to hand over a percentage of drug profits, and loyalty. In return, these gangs received protection in prison and status in the street hierarchy. But this also came with a price. Defiance, even perceived disrespect, was met with swift and brutal consequences. During the 1990s, the green-lighting process became more formalized. High-ranking EME members issued lists or verbal orders that traveled through prison networks and eventually reached street-level gang leaders. Communication was carried out through kites, coded messages, visitors, and corrupted prison staff. Among the earliest and most infamous green lights were those issued to Maravilla gangs, which had long resisted La M's control, and Sotel 13, a gang accused of refusing to follow orders and disrespecting mafia representatives. These green lights set a precedent. No gang, no matter its history or power, was above La M's authority. By the late 1990s, the green light list included multiple entire gangs and dozens of individuals. Sometimes green lights were public knowledge within the prison system, announced in yards or spread through rumor. Other times, they were silent but deadly. One of the key reasons for green lighting was refusal to pay tribute, the street tax demanded by La M. Gangs that controlled drug sales in their neighborhoods were expected to kick up a portion of their earnings to EM shot callers. This was non-negotiable. Those who refused were targeted. For example, a gang dealing meth or heroin in East LA might be ordered to pay a weekly fee to an EM representative. If they missed a payment, resisted, or attempted to hide profits, they risked being greenlit. The EM used its vast prison influence to send a clear message. Loyalty was not optional. The green light also became a tool for internal power struggles. MA members would sometimes greenlight rivals or defiant subordinates to consolidate their own influence. In this way, violence became both a political weapon and a means of financial enforcement. Several high-profile greenlights during the 1990s and 2000s had lasting impacts. Maravilla gangs, long considered independent and rebellious. Multiple Maravilla cliques were greenlit for defying La M's authority and refusing to pay taxes. This conflict spanned decades and resulted in numerous deaths. Sotel 13, this West LA-based gang, was greenlit in the late 1990s for defiance and perceived disrespect. The green light remained in effect for years, forcing some members into hiding or flipping alliances. 18th Street Gang. At various times, members of this massive, multi-ethnic gang were greenlit or targeted for discipline due to internal disputes, alleged cooperation with authorities, or failure to follow MA directives. Due to the gang's size, however, green lights often applied to specific sets or individuals. Florencia Treche. While typically loyal to La MA, subsets of F-13 were at times greenlit for infractions, showing that even top Sureño gangs could fall out of favor. The green light orders dramatically increased street violence in many Southern California communities during the 1990s and 2000s. Gangs under green light status were constantly under threat, leading to shootouts, assassinations, and preemptive strikes. Individuals accused of disrespect or being on the list were sometimes killed without confirmation, creating paranoia and mistrust even within the Sureño community. This period also led to a rise in internal purges. Gang leaders aligned with La M would eliminate their own members if they were suspected of being liabilities, cooperating with police, using drugs irresponsibly, or going against orders. The streets became an extension of prison politics, with neighborhood cliques acting like soldiers under a centralized, brutal command structure. Inside prisons and jails, green lights led to frequent riots, stabbings, and segregated housing. Gangs under green light were often forced into protective custody yards, considered shameful and dishonorable. For Maravilla and other defiant groups, this became a survival strategy, though it further solidified their pariah status in the prison hierarchy. Prison administrators and law enforcement struggled to manage the consequences of green light violence. Entire prison yards had to be cleared after coordinated attacks. Courtrooms required extra security during gang trials. Some institutions began separating greenlit gangs and applying validation processes to identify and isolate EME members. The green lighting era prompted major law enforcement operations in the 2000s. Federal and state agencies began using the RICO Act to prosecute Mexican Mafia members and associates for conspiracy, murder, drug trafficking, and extortion. Operations like Operation Black Widow and Operation Sudden Impact targeted top EME figures. Investigators used informants, wiretaps, and flipped gang members to build cases. One notable case involved Rene "Boxer" Enriquez, a high-ranking EME member who defected and became a key witness, exposing green-lighting practices and internal mafia operations. Despite these crackdowns, the green light remained a feared institution. Even the suggestion of being on the list could lead to murder or forced exile. Beyond violence, the green light era embedded a culture of fear and obedience across Southern California gang life. Young gang members were taught early to respect La M, avoid offending shot callers, and participate in green light enforcement when ordered. Disloyalty was equated with death. Many gangs began using coded language, special tattoos, and controlled communication to monitor loyalty and prevent infiltration. The green light was not just a tactic, it became a psychological weapon that kept entire communities under control. Number 2. The Mexican Mafia versus Black Guerrilla Family, Race, Power, and Prison Warfare in the 1970s to 1980s. The American prison system in the 1970s and 1980s was a crucible of violence, ideology, and racial division. Among the most brutal rivalries that emerged during this period was the one between the Mexican Mafia, La M, and the Black Guerrilla Family, BGF, two of the most powerful prison gangs in California. Their conflict was more than a turf war. It was shaped by race, politics, and control over criminal economies behind bars and in the streets. Though it used a pseudo-nationalist image to appeal to Chicano identity, the Mexican Mafia's primary goal was profit and power. It had no political ideology and was known for brutal discipline, ruthlessness, and efficient organization. In contrast, the Black Guerrilla Family, BGF, was founded in 1966 at San Quentin State Prison by George Jackson, W.L. Nolan, and other radical black inmates. The BGF was heavily influenced by Marxist-Leninist thought and the Black Power movement. Unlike La M, it was ideologically driven and sought to eliminate racism, overthrow the U.S. government, and establish a classless society. The BGF functioned as both a revolutionary organization and a prison gang. It demanded loyalty, discipline, and political education from its members. It formed alliances with black nationalist groups on the outside, such as the Black Panther Party, and saw itself as a vanguard movement for oppressed people of color. The 1970s were a period of rising racial tension within California prisons. The penal system had become heavily segregated, with alliances forming along racial lines. Whites were typically aligned with the Aryan Brotherhood, Hispanics with the Mexican Mafia, and blacks with the BGF. Despite their different goals, criminal profit for La M and revolutionary change for BGF, both groups found themselves competing for influence, territory, and control of prison operations. What began as simmering tension over turf and power soon exploded into open warfare. The Mexican Mafia, seeing BGF as a threat to its dominance in the drug trade and a rival power base among African American inmates, targeted BGF members for elimination. The BGF, in turn, viewed La M as a reactionary force that collaborated with white supremacists and perpetuated the racial oppression it vowed to dismantle. Throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s, California's prison yards became battlegrounds. Inmates were often forced to choose sides based solely on race, and attacks were both spontaneous and premeditated. One prison might see a stabbing in the yard, another, a retaliatory murder in the mess hall. One of the most notorious incidents occurred in 1970, when George Jackson was shot and killed by prison guards during a supposed escape attempt at San Quentin. Many in the BGF and broader black community believed Jackson had been assassinated due to his revolutionary leadership. His death radicalized many members and hardened the BGF's resolve against both the system and its enemies, La M included. La M saw this as an opportunity to consolidate its power. Working closely with the Aryan Brotherhood, despite the apparent contradiction in a Latino gang allying with white supremacists, the Mexican Mafia targeted black inmates and BGF members with calculated violence. These alliances were pragmatic, not ideological. The Aryan Brotherhood and La M shared interests in the heroin and methamphetamine trade, and they cooperated when it served their goals. Beneath the racial and ideological layers of the conflict was a fierce battle for control of the prison economy. The Mexican Mafia sought a monopoly over heroin distribution, gambling operations, and inmate taxation systems in Southern California facilities. The BGF, while politically motivated, also engaged in drug dealing and extortion to fund its revolutionary efforts and provide for its members. This created inevitable clashes. When BGF-affiliated inmates resisted La M's demands for tribute or attempted to set up independent drug operations, violence followed. Control over communication channels, contraband smuggling routes, and inmate networks became a matter of life and death. Both organizations extended their influence beyond prison walls. La M used its power to enforce rules among Southern California street gangs, sureños, effectively turning neighborhood crews into foot soldiers for the prison gang. Similarly, BGF members maintained connections with radical political groups on the outside, and some members participated in bank robberies, kidnappings, and revolutionary activity. However, by the 1980s, the ideological edge of the BGF began to dull. The organization became more focused on criminal enterprise than revolutionary goals, especially as new recruits were drawn more to protection and power than Marxist theory. This shift made the BGF more like La M in practice, even as racial and historic differences remained. As the violence escalated and prison administrators lost control of their facilities, law enforcement began to pay closer attention to gang dynamics. By the late 1980s, the FBI and state agencies started targeting gang leaders with conspiracy charges and employing the RICO Act to break up leadership structures. Wiretaps, informants, and sting operations began to reveal the inner workings of both groups. Notably, some members from both gangs eventually turned state's witness, breaking the code of silence in exchange for protection or reduced sentences. Still, despite numerous convictions and temporary leadership disruptions, the organizations proved resilient. The Mexican Mafia continued to evolve, becoming a feared and secretive force within the California criminal underworld. The BGF, while weakened, retained loyal members and a symbolic legacy as a political and racial counterforce. The Mexican Mafia BGF war of the 1970s to 1980s left a deep imprint on the American penal system. It shaped prison policies, including segregation practices, gang validation systems, and solitary confinement strategies. It also entrenched racial divisions that persist in prisons today. While overt racial warfare has declined in some prisons due to tighter controls and evolving gang strategies, the legacy of these battles lives on. The alliances and rivalries forged during this period continue to influence gang dynamics, not only in prisons, but in streets across California and the U.S. Moreover, the conflict serves as a lens through which to view broader issues: the failure of the prison system to rehabilitate, the social and racial inequalities that fuel gang membership, and the destructive power of ideologically or racially driven violence. The war between the Mexican Mafia and the Black Guerrilla family during the 1970s and 1980s was a brutal clash rooted in racial, ideological, and economic differences. It reshaped the prison landscape in California and left a legacy of violence, mistrust, and hardened gang structures that endure to this day. Understanding this conflict is essential to grasping the full complexity of prison gangs, the interplay of race and power, and the enduring challenges of criminal justice in America. Number 1. The Mexican Mafia versus Nuestra Familia, a gang war from the 1960s to present. The conflict between the Mexican Mafia and Nuestra Familia is one of the most notorious and long-standing gang rivalries in American criminal history. Rooted in deep cultural, geographic, and institutional divisions within the California prison system, this war has claimed hundreds of lives over the decades. More than just a gang feud, it represents a brutal struggle for power, identity, and control over the lucrative prison and street economies that span the state and beyond. Nuestra Familia, our family, emerged in the mid-1960s as a response to the Mexican Mafia's domination and abuse of Northern California inmates. Many of these men were Chicanos, Mexican Americans from rural areas in the Central Valley and Northern California cities like San Jose and Salinas. They felt disrespected by the more urban, Southern California-based Mexican Mafia, whose members often referred to Northerners as farmers, pateros, mocking their backgrounds and dialects. Tensions boiled over in 1968 at Soledad Prison when a Mexican Mafia member stole a pair of shoes from a Northerner. A fight ensued, and soon after, Nuestra Familia officially formed as a protective organization for Northern Latinos. That incident marked the start of a blood feud that would continue for decades. Although both organizations share Latino roots, they diverge in cultural identity and structure. The Mexican Mafia primarily recruits members from Sureño gangs in Southern California and adheres to a strict hierarchy with a top-down command structure. Loyalty to the organization supersedes any street gang affiliation. Nuestra Familia, on the other hand, is aligned with Northern California gangs, collectively known as Norteños, and is known for a more military-like structure. Unlike the Mexican Mafia, Nuestra Familia has often emphasized a political or revolutionary element, inspired in part by the writings of Chicano activist and former inmate George Jackson. Its members sometimes refer to themselves as soldiers, fighting against oppression and exploitation within the prison system. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the war between the Mexican Mafia and Nuestra Familia intensified behind bars. The California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, CDCR, often exacerbated tensions by housing members of both groups in the same prisons or yards, resulting in stabbings, beatings, and murders. Both gangs developed detailed communication systems involving coded letters, kites, messages, and smuggled contraband. Each organization created detailed hit lists and enforced a strict code of conduct. Inmates who cooperated with law enforcement or rival gangs faced brutal consequences. Pelican Bay State Prison and other maximum security facilities became key battlegrounds. The isolation of gang leaders in security housing units, SHUs, sometimes provided temporary calm, but often, even from segregation, leaders continued to issue orders that fueled the violence. The feud extended beyond prison walls into cities and neighborhoods across California. In the 1980s and 1990s, as street gangs affiliated with either the Mexican Mafia, Sureños, or Nuestra Familia, Norteños, the battle spilled into the open, especially in Central Valley towns like Fresno, Salinas, and Stockton. Drive-by shootings, drug turf wars, and retaliatory killings became common. One particularly bloody chapter occurred in the early 1990s in Salinas, where the Norteño gang East Market fought against Sureños affiliated with La AIM for control of drug trafficking routes. The violence was so intense that it attracted federal intervention and wiretap investigations that would later lead to large-scale indictments. By the late 1990s and 2000s, the FBI and local law enforcement began to target both gangs through RICO indictments. These multi-agency operations aim to dismantle the leadership of each group by charging them with murder, drug trafficking, extortion, and conspiracy. Operation Black Widow in 2001 was a significant strike against Nuestra Familia. Federal agents infiltrated the organization and arrested over 24 members, including high-ranking leaders. One of the key informants, Robert Happy Salas, provided detailed information about the gang's structure and activities. Similarly, the Mexican Mafia faced internal betrayal when René "Boxer" Enriquez, a high-ranking member, turned informant. His testimony helped dismantle portions of La AIM's operations and shed light on the gang's control over street crime in Southern California. Despite these efforts, both gangs adapted and continued their operations, often with new recruits rising to fill leadership voids. As of the 2020s, the war between the Mexican Mafia and Nuestra Familia has shifted. While open violence still occurs, particularly in contested areas like the Central Valley, both organizations have grown more strategic. Rather than constant open warfare, they often focus on controlling drug distribution and extorting protection money from gang-affiliated businesses. In some prisons, there have been temporary truces or agreements to reduce violence for mutual benefit. However, the ideological and territorial divisions remain deeply entrenched, and the potential for flare-ups remains high. Both gangs also face new threats from emerging rivals, like the Sinaloa cartel and other transnational criminal organizations that compete for dominance in drug trafficking and human smuggling. The Mexican Mafia Nuestra Familia war has had a devastating impact on Latino communities in California. Thousands of lives have been lost or ruined due to gang affiliation, incarceration, or violence. Generations of youth have been pulled into the gang lifestyle, often starting as low-level street soldiers for a cause they barely understand. This ongoing conflict has also fueled broader discussions about prison reform, gang rehabilitation, and the role of socioeconomic inequality in fueling organized crime. Community groups and former gang members have created intervention programs to steer youth away from gang life and reduce inter-gang violence. The conflict between the Mexican Mafia and Nuestra Familia is more than just a gang war. It is a long, complex struggle, born out of identity, inequality, and the violent dynamics of prison life. Despite law enforcement efforts and evolving criminal landscapes, the rivalry remains a potent symbol of the deep divisions within California's Latino gang culture. Understanding its history is crucial to addressing the systemic issues that sustain it.